I adjusted the collar on my dress blues and stared at myself in the mirror of a gas station bathroom off Route 9, 20 minutes from the church. My maid of honor had texted me 6 times. My mother had called twice. I hadn't answered either. The person looking back at me didn't need reassurance. She needed a minute of quiet before walking into a room full of people who had spent the better part of a decade pretending she didn't exist. I took a breath, checked the buttons, left. I should back up. I grew up in a house where my older sister was the sun, and I was whatever planet nobody bothered to name. She was beautiful in a way that made people stop talking when she walked in. Funny, quick, the kind of person who made every room feel like a party she'd personally arranged. My mother used to say that God had been generous when he made her. I used to wonder what that made me. Her name is Lydia. She's 4 years older than me, and she has never, not once in our lives, missed an opportunity to remind me of the distance between us. When I was 12 and she was 16, I came home with a perfect score on a math test. She was on the phone. She looked at the paper, handed it back and said, "Math is for people who aren't good at anything interesting." She wasn't cruel the way villains in movies are cruel. She was surgical. She knew exactly where the soft places were, and she pressed on them just hard enough to leave a bruise, then smiled like it had been a compliment. I joined the Marine Corps at 22. She called it a phase. My mother called it a waste. She had wanted me to go to law school, follow my father's path, wear blazers, and carry a briefcase and live inside the kind of life she could describe at dinner parties without having to explain herself. The military, she said, the night before I left for boot camp. I just don't understand why. I didn't explain it. I wasn't sure I could, not in words she'd accept. I just knew that I needed something that would ask everything of me, something that didn't care who my sister was. The recruiter's name was Staff Sergeant Webb. First time he looked at my paperwork, he looked back up at me with an expression I'd get used to. Skeptical. Not unfriendly, but skeptical. "You sure about this?" he asked. "I'm sure," I said. He nodded slowly, like he was filing that away for later. Boot camp broke me down and rebuilt me along lines I hadn't known existed. I don't want to make it sound poetic because it wasn't. It was exhausting and humiliating, and there were nights I lay in my rack staring at the ceiling thinking about how Lydia was probably at a rooftop bar somewhere, laughing, and here I was learning how to disassemble a rifle in under a minute. But something happened, somewhere in those weeks. I stopped thinking about what I looked like from the outside. I stopped measuring myself against her. There was no room for it. You either moved or you didn't. You either made it or you washed out. The Corps didn't care about my sister. That was the first time in my life I'd been somewhere that didn't. I made it through. I was assigned to a military police unit. My commanding officer, Captain Reyes, was the first person who looked at me like I had a future worth taking seriously. Not because I was impressive on paper, but because she'd watched me work. "Brewer," she said, "my last name, always my last name in that world, you don't know how good you are yet. That's either going to be your biggest problem or your greatest advantage. Which one depends on you." I thought about that for years. I wrote it on a note card and taped it inside my locker. Some girls put up pictures of their families. I had that sentence. The years moved the way they do when you're working too hard to watch them. I deployed. I came back. I deployed again. I was promoted. I was promoted again. I transferred to JAG, the Judge Advocate General's Corps, the legal branch of the military. Because Captain Reyes had been right, I was good at thinking, and eventually I found a place that rewarded it. I became a lawyer, a military lawyer. I prosecuted cases, defended service members, advised commanding officers on questions that had no clean answers. I was good at it. I was very good at it. None of this made it back to my family in any form they recognized as significant. My mother sent Christmas cards. I sent Christmas cards. Lydia texted me occasionally, usually when something good was happening in her life and she needed an audience. She got married to a man named Greg who sold commercial real estate and thought the military was a young person's game. She had 2 daughters. She posted everything online with captions full of emojis and little hearts. Occasionally, someone in her comments would find a picture of me and tag her, "Is that your sister in uniform?" And Lydia would reply with something like, "Huh, yes, she's very dedicated." Huh, the tone of someone describing a quirky hobby. I saw those replies. I didn't say anything. I just kept working. By the time I was 31, I had been promoted to major. By 33, I was a lieutenant colonel. The work was hard in a different way now, less physical, more relentless, the kind of exhaustion that lives behind your eyes and doesn't go away on weekends. I met my fiancé Owen at a conference in San Diego. He was Navy, a commander. He had kind eyes and a dry sense of humor, and he was the first person in a long time who made me feel like I could put something down for a minute without losing it. He asked me to marry him on a Tuesday night in October in the kitchen of his apartment while we were both still in uniform because neither of us had thought to change. He didn't get down on one knee, he just looked at me and said, "I want to spend the rest of my life with someone who doesn't pretend things are simpler than they are. Will you marry me?" I said yes. We started planning the wedding. I told my mother. She was happy. She called Lydia immediately. I could tell because Lydia texted me 40 minutes later. Mom told me, "Congrats. Please wear an actual dress, not your uniform, LOL. You have one chance to be a bride. Don't waste it on camo." I read it 3 times. She thought she was being funny. She thought she was being helpful even. That was always the thing with Lydia. She never saw herself as the problem. She was just being real with me. She just cared. I put my phone down and went back to what I'd been doing. I wore my dress blues to the wedding. Owen and I got married on a Saturday in April in a small church outside of Annapolis. We had kept the guest list tight. My side, my mother, my aunt, 3 friends from law school, 2 colleagues I trusted. Owen's side, his parents, his younger brother, half a dozen people from his unit. The other half of the church was filled with Marines and Navy personnel who had served alongside one of us at some point in the past decade. Owen had mentioned the wedding in passing to a few people. Word had spread the way it always does in military communities. Quietly, completely without announcement. I didn't know how many were coming. Owen had a guess, but even he underestimated. Lydia arrived with Greg 40 minutes before the ceremony. I know this because my maid of honor, who had been coordinating arrivals, texted me a screenshot of the seating situation and added, "Your sister just walked in and immediately started rearranging the programs. Thought you should know." I laughed. I was in a small room at the back of the church sitting very still, listening to the sounds of people finding their seats. My dress blues were pressed, my ribbons were straight, my shoes had been polished twice. I had done my makeup myself, plain and clean, the way I always did it when I needed to feel like myself. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock. At 1:57, one of Owen's groomsmen opened the door to my room and said, "You ready?" I stood up. "Yeah," I said. "Let's go." I don't know who started it. I've asked Owen. I've asked the groomsmen. Nobody takes credit for it, which makes me think it was spontaneous, which makes me think it was real. I was walking down the aisle, no music yet, just the sound of the space, when I heard the first chair scrape back. Then another. Then a sound like a wave moving through the room, 1 row at a time as people rose to their feet. Not all the guests, the military ones. They stood the way they'd been trained to stand, not at attention exactly. This was a church, not a formation, but straight, still, facing forward. Someone in the 3rd row said it quietly. Someone else said it louder. "Officer on deck." I kept walking. I don't know what my face did. I know my vision blurred for a second and I blinked it back, because I was not going to cry before I even reached the altar. I kept my chin level. I kept my pace steady. Owen was standing at the front of the church. He was watching me walk toward him, and his expression was the kind that doesn't have a name. Pride and love, and something quieter underneath, like relief. I reached him. He took my hand. Behind us, the rows of people sat back down. My mother, I found out later, had grabbed my aunt's arm so hard she left a mark. She told me afterward she hadn't known. She said it like a confession. Lydia didn't say anything at the ceremony. She didn't say anything at the reception either, not about the uniform, not about the church. She hugged me at some point and said I looked Really beautiful, actually. And her voice had something in it I hadn't heard before. Not admiration exactly. More like recalculation. Like she was doing math she'd been avoiding. Greg shook Owen's hand and said, "Man, I had no idea." I smiled. I let Owen answer. The reception was at a venue about a mile from the church. There was food, there was music, there was dancing. Owen's father gave a toast that made both of us laugh. My aunt gave a toast that made my mother cry. Someone from my old unit, a woman I'd served with in Okinawa, who I hadn't seen in 3 years, found me by the dessert table and hugged me without saying anything. We just stood there for a second, holding on. "You look good, LTC," she said finally. "So do you," I said. She laughed. "I'm still a captain." "Give it time," I said. At some point in the evening, I looked across the room and saw Lydia sitting at her table with Greg, watching the dance floor. She had a glass of wine. She was watching me dance with Owen, and she looked like she was trying to figure something out. I didn't go over to her. She came to me later, after the slow songs, when the room had gotten louder. She put her hand on my arm and said, "I want to say something and I need you to let me finish." I waited. "I didn't know," she said. "I mean, I knew you were in the military. I knew you'd been promoted. But I didn't know what that meant. I didn't take the time to actually understand what you were doing." She paused. She was not a person who apologized easily, and I could see the effort of it, the way she was holding very still. The way she was holding very still. The way those people stood up for you in that church. I've never seen anything like that, and I realized I've never seen anything like you. She stopped. I looked at my older sister. The son. The one God had been generous with. "Thank you," I said. "That means something." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't the end of anything, not really. We're not the kind of sisters who became best friends after a single moment. That's not how it works, not in real life. Not after years of distance that went both ways. But it was a start. And I found, in my line of work, that starts matter. You can build a lot from a start. My mother pulled me aside near the end of the night. The venue was clearing out. The lights had been turned up slightly, the way they do when things are winding down. She held my face in her hands the way she used to when I was small. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't understand either. I thought I was steering you toward something better. I didn't know you were already building it." I covered her hands with mine. "I know, Mom," I said. And I did know. I had known for a long time. That didn't make it small, but it made it something I could hold without dropping. She hugged me. Long, tight, the way she hadn't in years. Owen found me afterward and slipped his hand into mine and said nothing, just steered us toward the door. Outside, the April air was cool. A few people were still on the steps talking quietly, adjusting jackets. Someone had brought a flag. I still don't know who, folded neatly, set on a table by the exit. An old tradition, or someone's version of one. I picked it up, held it for a moment. All those years. All those rooms where I had been the background. All those moments I had swallowed something that wanted to be louder and just gone back to work instead. Standing still until everyone ran out of reasons to push me down. It works. That's the thing nobody tells you, because it sounds too simple and it takes too long. But it works. Owen squeezed my hand. I held the flag a little tighter and then I set it back down and we walked out into the night. I've thought a lot about what happened in that church. Not the ceremony itself, not the flowers or the food, or any of the things you're supposed to remember. I think about the sound of those chairs, the way it moved through the room like something that had been waiting for a long time to finally happen. People talk about moments of vindication like they're supposed to feel triumphant, like you're supposed to stand there and feel the scales tip and think, "See, I was right all along." That's not what it felt like. What it felt like was quieter than that. It felt like something being set down. Like I had been carrying a question for 12 years. Am I enough? Does this mean anything? Does anyone see me? And the answer had finally arrived, and it didn't arrive in a speech or a confrontation. It arrived in the sound of people standing up without being asked. That's the thing about doing the work in silence. You can't rush the proof. You can't manufacture the moment. You just have to keep going and trust that what you're building is real, even when nobody around you can see it yet. Lydia spent years looking at me and seeing the wrong thing. That wasn't cruelty exactly. It was a failure of attention. She saw the surface, the uniform, the early mornings, the deployments, and she made it mean something small. She filed me under, dedicated but limited, and moved on. That's what people do when they haven't learned to look past their first impression of you. And here's what I've come to understand. You cannot force someone to see you clearly. You can only make sure that when the truth finally lands, it lands undeniably. Captain Reyes told me once that the most dangerous thing a person can do is mistake motion for progress. I didn't fully understand it then. I do now. Lydia was always moving, always busy, always visible, always at the center of something. But she hadn't been paying attention to what was actually growing right next to her. That's not a character flaw. It's a choice. And choices compound over time the way interest does. You make enough small choices to look away, and one day you look up and there's a decade of distance you didn't notice accumulating. What I know is this: the people who stood up in that church didn't stand up because of a title. Titles are paper. They stood up because of the years behind the title, the decisions made under pressure, the integrity held when it would have been easier to let it go, the work done in rooms no one photographed. That's what gets honored, not the rank. The cost of the rank. I think about Owen standing at the front of that church watching me walk toward him. He already knew all of it. He'd been there for the long nights and the hard calls and the mornings when I didn't know if I had anything left. He didn't need the moment to know who I was, but I needed it. I think I needed to see it from the outside, just once. The shape of what I'd built, reflected back at me in the faces of people rising to their feet. My mother held my face in her hands that night and said she hadn't known. I believe her, and I've stopped needing her to have known sooner. What matters is that she saw it when it arrived. Lydia is still Lydia. We're still figuring out what we are to each other. But she came to me that night and said something true, and that matters. Character isn't fixed. People can grow if something breaks through the surface and makes them look honestly. I'm not telling you this story to make anyone the villain. I'm telling it because I spent years believing that invisibility was the price of doing things right. Turns out it's just the timeline. The work always surfaces eventually. You just have to still be standing when it does.